This is Risky Women Radio, a show to connect, celebrate, and champion women in risk, regulation, and compliance. Sharing insight and perspective from the most influential members of our global Risky Women network on the latest developments we need to think about, the challenges we should all talk more about, and the innovation we are most excited about in governance, risk, and compliance. Bringing together the hundreds of senior women professionals already connected with a new emerging group of leading women and men. I'm Kimberly Cole, your Chief Risky Woman. Welcome to Risky Women Radio. Today's Risky Woman is Clare Williams from Barclays PLC. Clare is Director, Head of Reputation Risk, Corporate Communications at Barclays. We're thrilled to have Clare join us today and talk about reputation risk.
I'm very thrilled to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. You've had a fascinating career, and I'm just going to give a brief synopsis. But you worked as a diplomat at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. You had postings all over the world, Paris, Moscow, Mexico City. You entered the financial industry with HSBC Corporate Communications and were involved in the integration of Midland Montague into HSBC. Then Credit Agricole, and you joined Barclays, I believe, in 2007 in corporate communications, and have obviously held a range of different roles in Hong Kong and now back in London. And obviously we met in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So tell me more. You started your career as a diplomat.
Yeah.
How's the journey gone?
How's the journey gone? Well, it's funny that we're actually having this conversation today because today is the day we're recording for the purposes of this interview on the day that the A-level results come out in the UK. So I remember very well, and I'm not going to say how many moons ago it was that I had my A-level results, and I'd completely crashed my French A-level, a language that I'd been learning since I was 3. And I just absolutely bombed it. And so university was completely out of the question. And my personal circumstances were such that I couldn't go back, do another year. So what was I going to do? And I was already doing a secretarial course because my parents thought that was always something useful to fall back on. And as a result of that year doing that, I then went into the Foreign Office. On that track. So to describe me as being a diplomat is probably a bit of a misnomer, although I did have diplomatic status in Mexico City by the end. But it was an interesting, it was a beginning of a very fascinating journey and really cemented my interest in geopolitics in particular, and just the world in general, and living and understanding different cultures. So Paris was just an extraordinary place to be for a young person. I loved it, but I'd always wanted to go to the Soviet Union as it was in those days. So off I went to the Soviet Union, where I had a very curious role in a tiny department, which was the scientific department, which back in the 1980s was sort of a questionable department as to what it was really going to achieve. And one of the key things that we were expected to do was that my boss was expected to do, was to go out into the fields and pick up a piece of wheat, and so that we would be able to assess what the wheat harvest was going to be like, and therefore the impact on the Soviet economy. I mean, really strange things like that he had to do. And we reported back to London with the sort of exercise in not quite futility, but it was interesting. And it was a fascinating place to be, just living in that environment of a very closed society with very communist and everything that goes with that. And then off to Mexico City, where I had a really interesting role working for the number 2 in the embassy, who was involved in economics and the commercial section. And this was I was there during the first Mexican tequila crisis. And so the ECGD were coming over, Bank of England, and all kinds of people flying in the IMF to try and sort Mexico's massive financial problem out. And that was what really got me interested in this other world, of which I had very little knowledge but was having some insight into. And so although I came back to London and worked for 2.5 years for the Foreign Secretary and had an extraordinary privileged time flying around the world with him and the team. And this was the time of apartheid in South Africa, when we were doing a lot of work with the frontline states, so travelled all over Africa, trying to resolve some of the world's very intractable problems at the time. But then, big bang, and this interest that I developed put me into it was actually Midland Montague, yes, the Midland Bank of old. And I went into corporate communications, starting off doing events and hospitality and conferences, sponsorship, but working in the brand team. So I got a very clear insight into marketing and advertising and how you use that as a tool to build reputation. And then I got involved in internal communications. And then I was incredibly lucky and got selected to go to university. Midland had a program at the time called Campus, where they identified leaders of the future who'd not been to university, and they put 24 of us per year through university. So I went and did a year full-time at City University, doing a diploma in management and organisational studies, which was an extraordinary opportunity for which I'm very grateful. And the day we finished our final exam was the day that it was announced that HSBC were buying Midland. And so that was, nobody was recruiting, but I was lucky in that I got a job in the newly re-energised Samuel Montague, which was the old merchant bank. And I worked there for 3 years, and then got involved in the integration of Samuel Montague and James Capel. So did a lot of integration communication. And by that stage, I'd done 7 years with the organisation. It had changed. I felt I needed to move on. So I signed my contract with Banque de Suez. And 6 weeks later, it was announced that it was being bought by Crédit Agricole. So I was doing integration communications again. So it really cemented those skills that I developed. But after a year, I got approached by Nomura, in fact, to go and work there and to be head of investment banking communications. And that was at a time when Nomura was really in the most unusual position of buying up what seemed to be, certainly to the media, most of England. I started in the July, and in the September we bought 7,500 pubs. And why were we buying 7,500 pubs? So that was a real baptism of fire for me, working with people, journalists on The Sun, explaining, the headline you can imagine was "Nippon down to the rising sun," but explaining securitization with them. So it was a very good time there, and I eventually became head of European communications when my predecessor left. And it was fascinating, because people would say, "Oh, what was it like working for a Japanese bank?" But actually, it was a very international bank with something like 75 nationalities working in the one building. So it was a real insight into a very multicultural environment, but with Japanese characteristics, without question. And then after 10 years there, I left and actually thought I wasn't going to continue in career in communications in investment banking. And the fact that if I told you this was February 2007, it would show you that wasn't very good at predicting the future in financial services. But Barclays, I was, again, very lucky that I had a good contact at Barclays, and I ended up, as you know, starting in Hong Kong in the October of 2007, just as the financial crisis was really beginning to take off. And that was, again, just that period in Hong Kong where we can talk about this. To some extent, Asia was inured to what was going on. It was impacted, but not to the degree that other countries were in the West. And so that's really sort of where I got to. That's my journey. It's been. My boss always describes it as being rather unorthodox route into communications, but I'm not so sure that it is, because we're always accused of spinning, right, as in corporate communications. But instead of spinning for my country, I was spinning for my company.
Excellent. Well, I love so many great elements there. Very global career. You've seen so many different things across different cultures and places. Communication, I think, is always key, no matter which industry, no matter which company that you're in. And then obviously integration and change, and we continue to see so much change and disruption today, so it'll be interesting to get into even more around that. So your role today in reputation management.
Yes.
Tell us more about what is that role and what are the key elements in that?
Yeah, there aren't many organisations that have a dedicated reputation risk team, from what I've been able to establish, and it is really it's twofold in that, I would say, in that one part is around governance. So I should explain that I sit in corporate communications, but reputation risk is one of our 8 principal risks at Barclays under our enterprise risk management framework. So the key risk officer is the head of compliance in the second line, but I sit in the first line, or my team and I sit in the first line, and we are really helping to support the business in understanding and mitigating reputation risk across the business, across Barclays. But we also have been helping compliance in developing a new framework, policies, and then working with colleagues in corporate relations and across the bank to develop standards under the reputation risk framework, so that we can do some kind of evaluation, quantitative evaluation, but it is a very qualitative principal risk. And I think the holy grail is always to be able to, of all people who cover reputation risk wherever they sit in an organisation, is to be able to develop some kind of amazing set of quantitative metrics. But I think there's a danger in that, because it never will give you the entirety of what is the reputation risk that you're running. And so that's what we're really looking at, is trying to advise the business when they're thinking of a new product or a new service, thinking about the reputation impact of what that could develop into. And then there will be certain transactions that we would look at to, again, look at the reputation risk for Barclays in particular, but sometimes more broadly so beyond Barclays, of the impact of what getting involved in a certain transaction might be.
And I'm sure we'll get into more of that when we get into the expert section, because I think there's probably intersections across lots of different areas there that we could talk about. But, really fascinating career. And as you said, it may be a little unorthodox. So, you have effectively changed industries. Your career path is sort of woven through different countries, etc. I mean, what advice do you have for people to pursue different opportunities and how to think about that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very clear that from the beginning of my career, I knew that I wanted to be in the Foreign Office and travel. And I always call it travelling safely, because you arrived at a destination and there was always somebody there to greet you at the airport, and you had somewhere to move into. So it was a very safe route, I have to say, but fascinating. And I think my advice would be, it depends on your character as to whether you want to leap into the unknown or do something with a bit more, or work for something that's a bit more structured. And again, we can talk about internal mobility within a large organisation, which gives you the opportunity to go abroad. And I went to Hong Kong, and that was a real risk for me and for Barclays. I mean, I hadn't worked for them before, but they sent me out there. Unknown quantity, really, although obviously they did their background checks. But then they gave me that opportunity to, and I didn't talk about this actually when I was in Hong Kong. I moved after 7 years of being head of comms to doing a role that I felt would broaden my skill set, which was to do diversity and inclusion and citizenship. And by citizenship, this was not the programming that we had across Asia, but more around the purpose, values, and behaviours. The new set of the new ambition for Barclays at that time. So that was, again, for me, taking quite a risk. And I think it's really important, and particularly nowadays, where nobody is going to have a monoline career. I just think those days are over, and people have to have develop the resilience to move into different industries and different sectors, and to be open to that challenge.
Yeah, that's very interesting because yes, that role in Hong Kong as the citizenship and diversity inclusion, obviously we had a lot to do with each other. And do you
Mm.
think a lot of those initiatives and the discussion around diversity, inclusion, and equality in society, do you think that's translating well and working with within the financial industry?
I do actually. I think I'm particularly from the UK perspective, where we now have to report on the gender pay gap. I
Mm,
think it's really having an impact. And I was thinking about it. I was talking to somebody last night, and saying that sometimes I think that it's unfortunate that most of our networks are called the Women's Network, and I think they should actually be reframed and called the Gender Equality Network, because I think it then brings the men much more into the conversation and the debate and their understanding. And as you know, I got very involved, or we are as Barclays very involved in he for she, and I think it's so important to have men as part of the thinking, how we're going to be able to make things better. And I think the other observation I have around all of this is that ESG, and I know we can talk about that a lot more also in a moment, but I think ESG investors, it's becoming more mainstream, and they are looking at what is the diversity, both in terms of gender, but also in terms of race, in not just in the boards, but in the leadership and what's coming through. So I think it's really becoming more and more important. And in this world where the kids coming through out of university have so much choice as to what they're going to be doing, and they look at financial services and they need to see that there is that it reflects them. That's the really important thing. So I think it is having a big impact on financial services, not just in the way we recruit people, think about recruitment, but also in promotion and bringing people. And if you're bringing people in at the more senior level, is not accepting a shortlist that is only men. You've got to ask for where are the women, and I think that's put a bit of a rocket also up the executive search consultancies also, that they have to give much greater consideration. They have to work harder. They have to find
yeah,
the women.
absolutely. Yeah, no, so that's interesting insights there. So let's move on to our expert opinion section. 2018 has already seen a lot of high-profile incendiary crises engulf well-known corporations. We've had governments and individuals, go through many issues, and there are many stories almost daily in the press. Even in my home country of Australia, we've got an ongoing Royal Commission. It's almost creating real-time examples of reputational challenges as it's looking at and investigating potential misconduct within the Australian financial services industry. So reputation has never been more fragile, and reputational threats are increasing exponentially. Amplifying this situation is the rapidly changing communications environment. So you've got the divide between new and traditional media is almost non-existent. Smartphones are the primary news source, and reputations can be built and or lost on a like. The need to understand and mitigate and manage risk has never been more acute. So I would argue your role is, getting even more important. So given your role and looking at reputational risk for a firm as large in scope and as scale as Barclays, do you feel that managing risk and reputation has become more challenging in the age of social media and the internet? And how is that playing out?
Absolutely. It is in this 24/7 world that we live in, where it's extraordinary, and it has become I think it's much more complex to manage, without question. Most people now joke about waking up every morning to see what the President of the United States has tweeted, and what impact that can have across the world on a client or on an individual that you might have a banking relationship with. I mean, it's absolutely huge. So it's very challenging, and it's just the sheer proliferation of bloggers, vloggers, you name it, that they're all out there, and they all have an opinion, and it's not always. You have to be able to. The challenge, I think, for people in corporate communications and people managing reputation is passing that and knowing who are the people who are the most influential, who can really have an impact on your reputation, and how do you manage them and how do you get to know them.
And how do you try to do that? How do you look at that ecosystem and try to manage and mitigate that risk?
Well, it's you obviously monitor all the time and have you're looking at news feeds, you're looking at social media feeds, you're getting reporting in on a daily basis to see what's going on, and some of it's a lot of noise, and some of it you then have to, as I say, just have that ability to look at it and go, actually this one's important. And it may be that they've only got, let's say on a tweet, maybe they only have 4.5 thousand followers, but who are those followers? So you need to go right through and really do your sort of your due diligence on these people to understand, just how important they can be.
And it's interesting because obviously it can have impact, yes, on the firm itself, but obviously the industry as well. Yeah. And I mean, if you look at things like, so reputation, you could pretty much start to marry very closely with trust. Yeah. And obviously financial markets and the trust in financial markets is fairly low at the moment. Yes. And if you look at the Edelman index, I think, and they rank all different industries, institutions, government, etc. So it's very challenging as to how you even build all of the, monitoring, anticipating what might be the issues. And as you said, like even when you're coming up with new products and stuff, you're having to look at all of that and across the globe.
Yes, and it obviously depends on your country of operation, but it's more about how can you it's being relevant to your clients, having that intelligence, that inside knowledge that a client in a certain sector who wants to go into a new country, and you need to be able to understand what their risks are and what the risks are that you have as an organisation in helping them develop that.
So what have been the greatest challenges that Barclays has faced in recent years, and how do you try to prepare and plan and anticipate for those?
Well, obviously the financial crisis in the last 10 years have been very challenging across the sector. That's a given. I think one of the biggest challenges we've had is preparing for ring fencing, which in fact has gone very well, but just effectively splitting the bank into Barclays International, which is more the investment banking corporate bank side, and then moving clients across into the Barclays UK side. That was there's a huge reputation risk around that if you haven't managed it well, and so you have to bring in multiple players across the organisation to make that work well, and then the whole communication with the clients who are impacted by the split, because you want them to have trust in you that it's going to work well. And you're right to come back to that earlier part of our conversation around reputation is trust. I think it's absolutely, if people cannot trust us to do our job well, then they're not going to bank with us. It's as simple as that. So reputation is all in this sector. In a services sector, it's everything. I mean, look what's happened to Facebook, and the knock-on effect of something like that, where they've had to hire 20,000 people in order to mitigate the risks that they ran. It's a huge operating cost if you get it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. The knock-on effects. And so do you think that your approach is different from previous styles of reputation and risk management, from the past, given all the change, given the social media elements,
well,
etc.?
I think what has happened is that reputation risk has risen up the agenda, and that it's become something that needs to, not just in Barclays, but in many other organisations, is much more sort of operationalised, and it becomes part of the strategic thinking. If we do this, what will the impact be? And I think to some degree that got lost in the last several, maybe couple of decades, that people hadn't really thought about it. It wasn't part of the culture to think about reputation. And I have this title of reputation risk, and that's really what I'm doing. I'm just helping to mitigate and support the business in getting it right. But every single person in any organisation has the responsibility of making sure that they don't damage the reputation of the bank or of themselves as an individual. You want to go and work. You want to be able to stand in a bar on a Friday night and say, I work for a good organisation, and this is what it does, and this is why you can trust us.
Yeah, it's interesting because every single touch point is going to have an impact on your reputation across the organisation. And that's quite, that's boiling the ocean in terms of where you could look.
Yes. So you have to put it into the business. You have to make sure that the business, yes, as I say, that you've operationalised it, that it just becomes, you don't even think about it, that it's just a given that what you're going to do, the decision that you take,
is the kind of right thing to do.
Is the right thing to do. Yeah.
So, is that kind of the key lesson to be learnt around how to manage reputation and how to manage that risk?
Yeah. Yes.
Embedded in the business.
Yeah. Put the responsibility, give them the tools and the frame, and as I said at the very beginning, the framework and the policy and the guidance, and then they get on and do the business, and I hope it doesn't go wrong.
And given several of the crises that have happened, and you mentioned Facebook, and there's been many others that obviously affect those individual companies, but more broadly. What's your view on, when should they communicate, what kind of things that they should say, and this whole kind of, can silence ever be golden, really?
I don't think silence can ever be golden. I think because given what we've just been talking about, the 24-hour nature of media these days and how things, if you don't address an issue pretty quickly, then it will get addressed for you, and you don't own it. Yeah. And so you cannot. That's why so many organisations have crises management plans. They have massive playbooks, but you can bet your bottom dollar that what you've been planning for is not what has actually happened to you. The Sidewinder missile comes in and you just have not seen it coming. And there's a great Judge Business School has this great saying, which is just plan for surprises.
Yeah.
And I think it's all you can, with the best will in the world, but you never know what's going to come.
And is there any, what do you think has been like really good examples of where there has been a particular, crises or reputational risk issue, not necessarily in Barclays, just more broadly, that you think has been handled particularly well?
Actually, that's an interesting one. I'm not sure that anybody's done it brilliantly yet, but I think what I would say is I've seen organisations who, when a crisis has hit and have learnt the lessons from that crisis and how they have then re-engineered their organisation and thought very hard about what kind of company they want to be and what they want to say about themselves. So something like Siemens, for example, which had that huge problem many years ago. And then I think if you look at the chemical sector in general, BASF, I think was at the time really. I think they set the bar very high for how you take a crisis and turn it into an opportunity, and just reframe whatever's going on in your sector. And I think the financial services sector has still probably got a bit of a way to go with that.
Yeah. And do you think there's a role for regulatory changes that would help sort of mitigate future scandals? And
well, I think from a financial services sector perspective, I think the regulations that have been put in place have been very good, and you hope that they are sufficient to make the sector safe for many years to come. But you just never know where the next crisis may come from, or where what may happen next. But I think more broadly around, so coming back to something like Facebook, or social media in general, where is the regulatory oversight? And I think there needs to be some thought given now to that, because it's moved from being these companies have moved from being startups and innovative and exciting and so on to being so embedded in everyday life that there's an expectation from multiple stakeholders that they're going to not behave well, but do the right thing. Again, comes back to doing the right thing. But the problem is that so much regulation was fit for the 20th century, but is not fit for the digital age, the 21st century. So I think there's a whole huge conversation that needs to go on. And necessarily government may not be the right people to work on this on their own. It needs to be a very collaborative effort because it impacts. It's just so invasive now. And how are they going to cope? How is government, or how are all of us going to cope with AI, automation, big data? The challenges that those are throwing up now are huge, and a government alone can't do it, or even in one large international body.
And we talked a little bit about other areas that you'd been involved in. So intertwining diversity and risk. Do you think there's a risk in lack of diversity?
Without question. I mean, you and I have talked about this in the past, and I haven't brought any of the statistics with me today, but the statistics tell you everything you need to know, that a more diverse company has better results. I referred earlier to the institutional investor community looking at this now, and I just don't think it's not going to cut it in the 21st century. The risk of not reflecting back the clients, the customers, the recruits that you want to have in your own organisation, then you're not going to succeed.
And across the broader, you mentioned ESG, environmental, social and governance before, and the investor community. So do you think now that there is a changing view, and that people will be judging more on how firms behave environmentally, how they behave, with good governance, and that you already mentioned from a, diversity perspective. But how does that play out with performance? Because a lot of people say the millennials are all going to invest in, and this is probably a bit off topic, but kind of interesting in terms of, will they really? They don't have any money at the moment to really make those investments to show us.
Well, I think they will. I think, yes, they don't have the money, may not have the money right now, but I'm sure they will, many of them. But coming back to the institutional investors in ESG, we were a member of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, part of the FSB task force that was set up by Governor Carney and Mike Bloomberg. And now we're working through with the UN and others on how we can take those the recommendations of the task force and bring them into the organisation and do reporting. And we are seeing people like BlackRock asking questions about, what are you doing about this? How are you going to implement the recommendations? So, as I say, we've been working on within a group of other banks to look at how we can do that, because it's highly complex, but there is an expectation that this will get done. And if we don't, my view, it's my own personal view, is that if banks don't do it, then the regulators will make us do it. So, it's a sort of,
that's good then. So, Claire, is reputation management a new area?
No, I don't think so. Socrates, 4th century BC, said this: regard your good name as the richest jewel you can possibly be possessed of, for credit is like fire. When once you have kindled it, you may easily preserve it. But if you once extinguish it, you will find it an arduous task to rekindle it again. So this has been going on for millennia, people concerned about reputation, which, as we know, takes a long time to build, but a nanosecond in this 24/7 world to destroy.
Yes, indeed. Very good. Connecting, celebrating and championing women in risk, regulation and compliance, Rescue Women Radio takes an intimate look at the rants and revelations of the top women shaping the debate and the industry. Okay, our next section is one of my favourites, Risky Women, Rants and Revelations. So what is your revelation, that piece of advice that you would like to give to our listeners and that, who are maybe starting out in their careers?
Yeah, I thought long enough. I wish I'd been bolder, younger, and just leapt out, not done that, not done the safety blanket, but just gone, right, okay, the world is my oyster. I'll just go out and grab it. And I should have done it earlier.
Excellent. And your rant, what one thing would you like to change now?
I'm with you, and I'm such an admirer of the work that you've done on modern slavery and the challenges. And since moving to the UK, where it is less obvious, because I think when you've worked in Asia and you travel a lot in Asia, you see it around you all the time. And actually, I think in the UK it can feel very hidden. And every time I go into a nail bar now, I look and see, are these girls Vietnamese? And I wonder if they've been in any way coerced into doing what they're doing. And I would like the UK in general to be much more alive to what is under their nose.
Yeah, hidden in plain sight.
Hidden in plain sight, exactly.
Excellent. Risky Women is a vibrant network at the centre of a global community in a rapidly growing, evolving and influential industry. Given the continued pace of change, our rapid fire round revisits the most pressing topics to share ideas and offer listeners new perspectives. Okay, now, finally, in our wrap-up, our Risky Women rapid fire round. What one word would sum up the world from a governance, risk and regulation perspective for you?
Uncertainty.
And what do you think is our top risk for 2018?
Geopolitical uncertainty.
Any cures for the cost of compliance or the cost of regulation?
AI.
Excellent. And biggest technology impact on compliance and risk?
Yeah. AI. Same again.
And outlook for the year ahead, are you optimistic, pessimistic or uncertain?
Well, I'm a mixture of the three. Am I allowed to be that?
Yeah.
I'm optimistic for me and the way Barclays is going, but I'm slightly pessimistic about some of the things that are going on in the world and therefore uncertain.
Well, thank you very much, Risky Woman Clare Williams.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this exciting episode of Risky Women Radio to connect, champion and celebrate women in risk regulation and compliance. I'm Kimberly Cole, based in Hong Kong. For more information on the Risky Women Global Network, head to our website in the episode notes and please be part of the ongoing conversation by subscribing to this podcast, connecting with us at Risky Women on Twitter, or even reaching out to me directly by email.